in chapter 4 under the heading Protections Circumvented, and we are on page 37 discussing separation of powers. I'm not exactly sure how far we will get today, but let's pick up where we left off last time. There is one apparent exception to this consolidation of bases of power, that of the Electoral College. Because I do not specifically address this in the book, and I've written several essays on the Electoral College, and I had a really great webinar in 2020 that covered a lot more, but the Electoral College is actually one of the best safeguards against democracy. Yes, I said against democracy. If you are just joining the conversation, I implore you to go back and listen to the previous episodes. Anyway, many Americans think they want to replace the Electoral College with a national popular vote system, which would be close to democracy. But there are a few things I want to point out about that, and maybe no one would be happy with eliminating the Electoral College. So the first thing I want to mention is what I mentioned before. We are the only Western democracy that does not vote strictly for parties who then choose the delegates and the president and the other offices. And this was intentional by the founders because we were not supposed to be a democracy. And secondly, I find it very interesting when people see a problem with the system that would, instead of being solved by eliminating the system, would actually be exacerbated by eliminating the system. Several Americans think that if someone loses the popular vote but wins the electoral vote, that this is evidence of the unfairness or unnecessary nature of the Electoral College. The reality is that the Electoral College actually solves the minority president problem, like Trump winning over Hillary in 2016. The Electoral College does not cause this, okay? So what do I mean by this? Well, there are candidates from parties on the presidential ballot other than the two candidates from the two major parties of Democrat and Republican. But because these third-party candidates cannot win a majority in any state, they are in reality precluded from the presidential race. I mean, they're never going to win because of the system the Electoral College sets up. Eliminating the Electoral College would actually allow more candidates, and thus more parties, an actual shot at the presidency. But what would that mean for the election? Let's consider the 1992 election, if you would, to try to examine this idea. In 1992, Bill Clinton did not win the majority of the popular vote. Remember, the majority equals 50% plus 1. And actually, he did not win the majority in 1996 either, but 1992 offers a way better example to illustrate my point here. In 1992, Clinton won only 43% of the popular vote. And Bush, 41 or HW, won 37% of the popular vote. And Ross Perot won 19% of the popular vote. So for the sake of argument, let's say Bush 41 represented social conservatives and Perot represented fiscal conservatives. And at this point in our country's history, both social or moral conservatives and fiscal conservatives tended to end up in the Republican camp. But because of Perot, these voters were split between two candidates, essentially giving Clinton the win in 1992. So now, if we kind of extrapolate that to a nationwide presidential campaign without the Electoral College, going to a straight popular vote, I think, might just empower outside groups. Some might even call them fringe groups, to become part of the national election. It opens up the possibility of, I don't know, two candidates running on the left and another two running on the right. So instead of two presidential candidates, we now have 4 or more probably, but if it gets too messy, you might not be able to follow the example. So with the national vote now divided between 4 candidates instead of essentially 2, it would be highly likely that no one candidate would win the actual majority of the popular vote. And so, well, maybe they won the most votes though, right? Maybe. But as a nation, what would we think about that? What would be the best recourse if, let's say, one candidate won 23% of the vote, another candidate won 25% of the vote, the third candidate won 25% of the vote, and the fourth candidate won 30% of the vote? Would a candidate elected by the most votes, but only 30% of the people, be truly representative of this country? Or what do we do? What should we do in that case then? I mean, should we do what we do in some local elections where we have a runoff election? And then how much legitimacy would our system retain while we waited for a runoff election for president, especially if those numbers are as close as I just put out there? In 1992, Bill Clinton, remember, won only 43% of the popular vote, but he won 69% of the electoral vote, granting him much more legitimacy than his 43% would have normally afforded a candidate. Thanks to the Electoral College, there was no issue made about a minority president in 1992. Part of the beauty of the Electoral College is the legitimacy it gives any president. Clinton won 69% of the electoral vote, the clear winner. Although, just like disappointed Gore voters railed against the Electoral College in 2000, I mean, Hillary supporters did not have the same kind of energy in 2016 for a number of reasons. But just like Gore voters didn't like the Electoral College in 2000, it was a big uproar. Republicans previously had the same kind of reaction against third-party candidates in 1992. Because the Electoral College was supposed to keep third-party candidates out of the national race. And that's another part of democracy we could talk about. But thanks to the Electoral College, Bill Clinton assumed office with the legitimacy of a majority president, even though he received only 43% of the vote. So you might want to start thinking about things in a different way again, right? Would it be good to get third and fourth and fifth and sixth parties involved in the national election for president and actually let them have a shot at it? Is that something that would be good? And then how do you think the Electoral College, eliminating the Electoral College, might affect the legitimacy of the election for president? And how many of you would be willing to be governed by a president who at least initially won 30% or less of the national popular vote everyone seems to want in place of the Electoral College? And what if this president was not one of the two major parties and he had no supporters in the House or the Senate because he or she was not from one of the two major parties and thus has no legislators supporting them in Congress? And what implications do you think that might have for the executive branch as a whole? And would those implications be all bad? Something to think about. All right, the third thing I wanted to point out, remember that federalism, which we will come to next at some point in this chapter, remember that federalism is helpful because the issues facing one part of this vast and varied country are not necessarily the same issues all Americans face, even if they are trying to convince all of us that we all care about the same few topics. So remember that 2016 election I just was talking about. Take a look at the map for that election, for that presidential race's outcomes, and keep in mind that red equals Republican and blue equals Democrat. While some people don't like the Electoral College because it is less democratic, because the majority did not win and so they don't feel represented, The other way to look at the situation is to see what happened in 2016 and 2000 as actually demonstrating that the Electoral College works the way it is supposed to. Because it is possible to win the electoral vote without winning the national popular vote, it actually proves the effectiveness of the system, protecting the political minority from the political majority. This tyranny by the majority, it protects the political minority from democracy. And so how does this prove that the system works, right? Because you cannot simply trample the interests of the political minority. It protects the interests of the political minority. I mean, if you think about it, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 by just simply racking up massive majorities in the major cities and urban counties. But she lost almost everywhere else in the nation. She won just 487 counties compared to Trump's 2,626 counties. And people say, well, it's not done by county, it's done by, popular vote. But even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, she could fly from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles without ever passing over a single county she was able to win. Think about that. Do you think it would be good for candidates to only focus on cities and metropolitan areas? What about farmland? What about the natural resources and all that beautiful countryside that would not have their interests represented? Can a president truly represent a country when he or she never addresses the issues of 2,626 counties out of only 3,000 or so? I mean, if you want to think about comparing it to another race, in 2012, Romney won 2,417 counties. I mean, that's 17 fewer than Bush did in 2000 and almost 200 fewer than Trump won in 2016. But Romney still lost the national vote to Obama. And this comparison, I think, demonstrates a need to have wide geographical and a wide political base in order to be elected in our two-party system. And again, with the creation of the Constitution, the founders were looking to avoid democracy as they saw this as the tyranny of the majority. Protecting minority interests, giving the minority a larger voice than they would have in direct democracy was important and should still be important to us. And when the popular vote goes one way and the electoral vote goes another, many people argue that the majority should rule, but that's that democracy voice in their head. And that would not allow for the voice of a vast geographical area to be heard on the national stage. And you know what? Proponents of democracy would be fine with that. Remember, if you are on the losing side in a democracy, you don't deserve to be heard. But what about all the varied interests because we are such a big country? I mean, we do span from sea to shining sea. Now, the U.S. Constitution is very clear that all elections are supposed to be local, even for the one office that represents the entire nation. Recently, however, there's been a drive to centralize all election law. In 2019, a bill was introduced in and passed by the U.S. House of Representatives that would give the federal, national government unprecedented control over U.S. election administration nationwide. Quote, the legislation, which passed the House last week on a 234-193 party line vote, would weaken the security that comes from diverse state systems. End quote. This is from Senate RPC policy paper HR 1, Federalizing Elections and Chilling Speech. The bill's intent is federalizing, nationalizing an electoral system that has evolved through diverse mechanisms and over more than 230 years, even though the decentralized nature created by the system was the primary defense against rigging elections. Why would those already in power want to eliminate such a reliable safeguard? Even though the U.S. Constitution clearly makes all elections local, allowing states to set up elections, which also maintains the divided power of federalism between state and central government, Article 1, Section 4, Article 2, Section 1, the bill was reintroduced in the next Congress, H.R. 1, For the People Act of 2021. And it takes such powers completely out of the hands of the states. Such bold attempts at nationalization not only undermine the separation of powers, but is also a threat to republicanism, federalism, and intertwined responsibilities, or checks and balances. And I'm just going to end with that word federalizing. They have done such a great job at manipulating our understanding of this word too. Just like democracy. When they say federal government, they mean national government. When they say federalizing, they mean nationalizing. And the word federalism itself means the opposite of nationalizing everything unto the central government. It means states have power to do things the central government is forbidden to do by the Constitution. I mean, this is all part of the complex conscience of government. Federalism also means states can share in many of the same powers the national central government claims as its own. So this is another word that is being used as a euphemism to cover up for the fact they want to consolidate power into fewer and fewer hands, all located in basically one place, Washington, D.C.